Alright guys, this is the video for chapter 11, guided reading for the Aztecs. I'm going to go through this quickly. Make sure to pause the video to get answers to the questions and read the entire slide because I'm not actually reading the entire slide. I'm just hitting the highlights. Alright, we're going to talk about the Aztec rise to power. They come to power after the fall of the Toltecs. Basically, most of Mexico was kind of very regional and small, and nobody really had taken over all of it. And the Aztecs are going to come in and they're going to be able to take power very quickly. The Aztecs were a group of 10,000 that migrated to Lake Texcoco. They joined other groups in the area who were competing for power. This is similar to the Mediterranean Europe, in which different groups used political alliances, intermarriages, and maneuvers to gain power. The key to power during this time in central Mexico was your military. And most groups speak Nahuatl, which is the language of the Toltecs, including the Aztecs, and that helped them to gain control because they spoke the same language. Alright, when they first arrived, the Aztecs were disliked and distrusted by other dominant groups, but they had a reputation for being tough warriors and fanatical followers of their gods. For example, human sacrifice is incredibly important to the Aztecs, which we'll talk about in a little bit when we get to the religion. Tenochtitlan is the capital of the Aztecs, and it was built on a marshy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. So basically, they built their city, which was one of the greatest cities in the Americas at the time, in the middle of a lake. It's quite incredible. We'll talk more about that again later. From Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs became involved in regional politics, and then later they're going to be able to take over different places. In 1434, they made an alliance with two other states, and eventually they're going to control much of the land and tribute in central Mexico. Aztec social contract. A social contract is an agreement between the ruler and the ruled. People under Aztec control were forced to pay tribute, surrender their land, and provide military service. Through expansion and conquest, the Aztec society changed. Started as a loose association of clans, it had become a hierarchical society ruled by a supreme leader who controlled civil power and represented God on earth, which is divine right, when you think your leader is somehow connected to God. Described as people chosen to serve gods during this time, human sacrifice greatly expanded. Basically, what the Aztecs are doing is when they go out and they conquer, they take prisoners of war, and then they take those prisoners of war and they use them for human sacrifice. So a lot of their conquest was motivated by having humans to sacrifice to please the gods. Religion and ideology. Their religion was vast, uniting, and oppressive. They're polytheistic. They did believe that there was little difference between the human world and the world of the gods, very similar to the Romans. Their deities are nature deities, and they ended up having over 128. These deities could take different forms, similar to the Hindu gods. They have lots of ceremonies and festivals that praise the god, including the human sacrifice. They have three major cults: fertility and agriculture, creator gods, and warfare and sacrifice. The most important and central god to the whole cult was Huitzilopochtli. Alright, they got their first two gods are from the Toltecs, so those were copied. That's Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl. And most importantly is Huitzilopochtli. He is the old sun god. He is a warrior that fought the forces of night. Basically, they believe that Huitzilopochtli was what would make the sun rise in the morning. And to keep Huitzilopochtli happy, they had to feed him with human sacrifices. And then the sacrifice would happen, and then the sun would rise again. They also would have more sacrifices in the winter when the days were longer because they thought that the gods were displeased, and they would sacrifice more, and then the gods would get happy during the spring and the summer, and they would have more sunshine. Alright, Tenochtitlan again is their major city. The Aztec Empire was organized into city-states. Tenochtitlan was the central city-state, but it wasn't that much bigger or more productive than the other city-states. It's just really famous because of its location in the middle of a lake. They had 4 causeways, which basically are bridges that would connect to the mainland, and they also used canals for transport. They had city wards, which means the cities were divided into different groups called that were controlled by the Calpuli, And the Kalpuli are basically local representatives that represent particular kin groups that live in the different wards. Um, and Tenochtitlan, if you didn't know, is modern day Mexico City. All right, feeding the people, economy of the empire. They depended on traditional forms of agriculture, and innovations were developed. The most important innovation of the Aztecs was the chinapas. When you build your central city on a lake, you need to figure out a way to turn that lake into land, and they would use chinapas, which are beds of aquatic weeds, mud, and earth placed in wooden frames and floated on the lake. So basically, they made a frame, they would fill it with mud and crops, and then they would float it on the lake so that the lake would feed it with the water, and then they would get crops. And they had 20,000 acres of these on Lake Texcoco, which is a lot. Also, the great thing about Chinapas was they could yield 4 different crops a year, which meant they were constantly harvesting and having more food for their people. The land was worked by the peasants. The land was divided by the local clan. So the Kalpuli would divide the land, and then different groups would work the land. They also had periodic markets in which people could sell for different goods that they wanted. Um, they did have one really big market that operated daily in Tenochtitlan, and it was controlled by the Pochteca, which are the merchants, and those merchants specialize in long distance trade of luxury items. So they would get those luxury items and bring them to this market so that people could get goods from all over the empire. And the state controlled, so the government controlled the use and distribution of many commodities, most from tribute. All right, Aztec society in transition. They're going to end up having a widening social gulf, meaning there's going to be a expansion between the rich and the poor. The empire is divided into 7 Kalpuli, so 7 clans. All right, and those clans controlled local life. They did things like distribute land, organize labor, organize the military units. They were governed by family heads, which means the leading male in particular families would make the decisions, and not all Kalpuli were equal. Some were wealthier than others. As the Aztec Empire expanded, so did its social structure. The military and administrative nobility began to overpower the heads of the Kalpuli. So originally, the Kalpuli really held the power, and as their military might grew and they expanded, nobility and the military are going to take power. They have a very good military. It's broken into ranks based on experience and your success at getting those captives for human sacrifice. As the empire grew, the gap between the nobility and the commoner is going to expand as they become wealthier, and this is one big change that happens during the Aztec Empire. They go from being a relatively egalitarian or equal society to being a socially stratified society, which was based on power, money, your military experience. Social classes were divided by, or you could tell which group was from which social class based on hairstyle, clothes, uniform, etc. The Romans also did this. As the nobles broke free of Kalpuli and acquired their own land, a new class of laborers or serfs developed. They did not control land and worked at the will of others. They had very low social status, but they were above captives and criminals, so they were not sacrificed. Overcoming technological constraints. Women's roles in the Aztec Empire are very specific because they don't have the technology to provide the food, and women spent a huge amount of their time making the food, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. Peasant women helped in the fields, but they also were the caretakers of the kids. Weaving, women who could weave well were highly regarded. They also taught young girls. Marriage is arranged. They have polygamy within the nobility, and that was really to produce children. Polygamy came out of the fact that many women would die in childbirth, so many men took more than one wife so that they would have sons or an heir. All right. Women could inherit property, and they were subordinate but complementary to men. All right, technology. Women would spend 6 hours a day grinding corn by hand, while in the Mediterranean, water-powered mills did this. So a lot of the time, women were stuck producing cornmeal to feed their families, and they didn't really have a lot of time to do things outside the home. All right, and they could control a large population with fear of sacrifice, so they didn't need technological advances. If you're worried that you cross the line that you're going to be sacrificed to the gods, you're more likely to do what you're told without much questioning. All right, they have a tribute empire. The emperor was a great speaker of Tenochtitlan. He had private wealth and public power. He could not be looked in the eye, which is also traditional in other areas in the Middle East with the Abbasids and the Umayyads. In China and the dynasties, it was considered disrespectful. The emperor was chosen from the royal family. They had a prime minister and a council of representatives from the other city-states. So they don't rule absolutely, meaning they make every decision. They have advisors. Tribute was needed for the state to obtain victims for human sacrifice, and that, as I've already said, is what motivated them for expansion and further conquest. Needed those humans to make Huitzilopochtli happy. Ooh. All right, last little bit. City-states were left unchanged. They recognized Aztec supremacy, and as long as they paid their labor and their tribute, they were pretty much left alone. Aztecs were successful because they exerted political domination without direct administration or territorial control. Meaning, as long as they got their humans for sacrifice and they got their tribute, they would leave people that they had conquered relatively alone as long as they followed the rules. And their collapse was caused in part by increasing power of the nobles and the extensive use of human sacrifice. We're going to learn about their collapse when we learn about the beginning of the Age of Exploration and the Spanish conquistadors arriving in central Mexico. So again, make sure you take your time watching this, answer the questions on the guided reading, and I will see you all in class.